you all for coming, and I'd like to reinforce what you said there about the wonderful collections in Arkansas. It's absolutely amazing what exists here in Little Rock, and most of the material that you're going to see here, not all of it, but maybe about 80% of it, comes from research in the libraries here in Little Rock, with the support of the wonderful staff of all the different libraries, and for which I thank you. This presentation is about women's struggle for the vote and the effects of their victory. And I'll focus mostly on Little Rock after the Civil War, and I'll be weaving local people and places and events within the national context. And I'm going to bring the history right up to date. This cartoon from June 1919, it captures the terms of the debate, of the Votes for Women debate. Basically, it's saying that without a say in government, with women's exclusion from politics and lawmaking, women were not free citizens, making a mockery of the notion of American democracy. Now, these ideas had been expressed long before 1919, during the post-emancipation debates about freedmen after the Civil War. And women had suspended their campaign for equal rights, including the vote, for the duration of the war. Many leaders at this time, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had campaigned for the complete abolition of slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation, and women expected to be included in any reforms. In 1865, Anthony stated women's position in a speech in Ottumwa, Kansas. The inalienable rights of the Negro belong equally to women. Government of universal manhood suffrage will not be a true republic. Still, one half of the people will be in subjection to the other half, and the time will come when an accounting must be made with this other subject class. The duty of the national government is to guarantee to every citizen the right of self-protection, and this right for woman as for man is vested in the ballot. Anthony was arguing for universal adult suffrage as the guarantee of individual liberty, which meant including women in any voting reforms. Now, living in Ottumwa, Kansas in May 1865, according to that year's census, was Clara Alma Cox. She was a school teacher, and there's a good chance that she heard Anthony's speech that day because it took place on July the 4th. It was a huge celebration, obviously. In August 1866, Clara was in Little Rock to marry George W. McDermott, who was stationed in the Arsenal. A 1919 article described Clara McDermott as an abolitionist of the most pronounced type. She believed in equality for all people regardless of sex or colour. And I always sense the disdain in that quotation, by the way it was written. Anyway, at this point in 1866, the stage was set for the struggle for women's suffrage in Arkansas. The 14th Amendment led to the first link between Arkansas and the national women's suffrage movement. Now, that amendment first stated that anyone born or naturalized in the US is a citizen, that the state cannot abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens or any state, not just the US government, and that everybody has equal protection under the laws. Now, this nullified the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which said that black Americans were not citizens. It also made unconstitutional the new anti-black legal codes of several states. But this amendment was duplicitous. Section 2 reduced a state's representation in Congress if it denied any adult male the right to vote. And this was the first time that the word male had appeared in the Constitution, and it allowed states to continue to deny, with impunity, the female half of the population the right to vote. The 14th Amendment effectively abridged the rights women believed they should have under the Constitution, and Antony's subject class remained subject. Now, this deliberate segregation by sex in the right to vote caused a huge controversy. Some argued that freedmen needed the protection of the ballot more than women did. Some women argued that a restrictive amendment would ultimately lead to women getting the vote. But Antony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton argued if that word male ever went into the Constitution, it would lead to a 50-year fight to get it out. And the controversy led to a huge split and the establishment of two separate women suffrage groups. Enter Arkansas. The 14th Amendment was being ratified in 1868, and in February that year, Miles Langley, a delegate at the Arkansas Constitutional Convention, attempted to preempt this injustice to women by including universal adult suffrage in the Arkansas Constitution. His proposal was thrown out, and everybody was laughing at it. Actually, if you read the newspapers of the time, it's quite disgusting what went on. But now, this defeat of women's suffrage in 1868 is, I'm sorry to say, a terrible failure in Arkansas history, because if Arkansas had given women the vote in 1868, it would have been the very first state in the Union to do so. And I think that is a sad thing in our history to be carrying forward with us. But anyway, the US was still not finished with discriminating against women. In 1870, the 15th Amendment reinforced the illegality in voting rights of discrimination on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But Congress refused to ban discrimination on account of sex. So these two amendments, the 14th and the 15th Amendments, locked into the Constitution inequality under the law on account of sex. And this inequality exists to this day. Now, women on the national stage did not take this abridgment of a citizen's privileges and immunities lying down. Some tried to vote anyway as citizens under the Reconstruction Amendments. But the judgment in the case of one woman who voted stated, "The legal vindication of the natural right of all citizens to vote would involve the destruction of civil government." And that was the attitude there. And here Susan B. Anthony is pilloried for voting, and she was arrested. She went to trial. The judge refused her a jury trial. It was one of the most celebrated trials in the late 19th century. And Anthony had hoped to take her case all the way to the Supreme Court, but she failed, and I won't go into the details of that. But Virginia Minor succeeded. She was refused registration in 1872, and she sued. And interestingly enough, she launched her challenge in exactly the same court in St. Louis, where the justices handed down the Dred Scott decision in 1857. And it's as a National Historic Park, and they put the two cases together there. I haven't managed to visit, but I would recommend it if you can do it. In 1874, the US Supreme Court decided in Minor's case that citizenship did not mean an automatic right to vote, which is very different from what we seem to think today. Now, Susan B. Anthony had already declared during her own case, if we once establish the false principle that United States citizenship does not carry with it the right to vote in every state in this union, there is no end to the petty freaks and the cunning devices that will be resorted to exclude one and another class of citizens from the right of suffrage. And Anthony was 100% right on the money, having already established through women which is effectively 50% of the population, a gigantic restriction on citizens' right to vote, it was relatively easy then to turn on a much smaller group. In 1875, a year after Minor's case, the US Supreme Court began to limit the restrictions of the 15th Amendment on discrimination against freedmen. So you can see how the two discriminations were tied together. And this was a huge impetus to emerging Jim Crow laws. For once black men could be excluded from the vote by various means, not relating to race, they could be excluded from anything. After this decision, the Virginia Minor decision, suffragists decided the only way to win votes for women was by a constitutional amendment, and Anthony introduced that in 1878. As this battle was going on, women's suffrage came up in Little Rock several times, such as when Phoebe Cousins, illustrated here. She was of Missouri. She spoke in the City Hall, which used to be on Markham Street, the old one was there in 1870. Now, Cousins is the second link between Arkansas and the national suffrage movement. She later became a leading light of Susan B. Anthony's National Women's Suffrage Association, and she may also have been involved in the founding of the first suffrage organization in Eureka Springs in 1881. But the cause picked up momentum in Arkansas in 1888 when Clara McDermott, remember her from Kansas? She emerged from the domestic sphere and helped found the Arkansas Equal Suffrage Association. Newspapers show that several suffrage meetings took place here in Clara's house at 1424 Center Street, and we're lucky to have a house still standing associated with that history. And the letter announcing the founding of the AESA, which I've got up here with it, was very likely written in that house because she was living there at the time. Now, Clara's work led to another link with the national movement. Susan B. Anthony's visit in 1889. Anthony spoke here twice, once on temperance and once on suffrage. The suffrage one is at the Capitol Theatre, and the one on temperance was at the Grand Opera House on Main. Now that block still, it's a heritage block now, but the actual building is gone, unfortunately. And this was Anthony's first visit to the South. In 1889, Clara built headquarters for women's groups, and both temperance and suffrage workers met there. It was 303 to 305 Markham Street, and they met there for several years in the 1890s. And there's a little, over to the right of the top photograph, there's a little 3-story building. That's where it was. This is the only photograph I've been able to find of it, but I'm really glad I've got a photograph of it. It's terrific. This comes from Butler Center. And down below, at the very end of that photograph, and this was, I took this before I knew exactly where it would have been, it was opposite the old State House, but you can see what is there today. Now, by this time on the national scene, this was about 1890, the two major suffrage groups, the American and the National Women's Suffrages Associations, had joined together and become the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NOSA. And it focused on suffrage through the states while the federal amendment languished. Clara McDermott died in 1899, and the next year, Carrie Chapman Catt, then recently elected president of NOSA, spoke at the YMCA at 8th and Main. And after Catt's visit, nothing is known about votes for women in Arkansas for 10 years. Washington State became the 5th equal suffrage state in 1910, and this victory may have triggered the women's suffrage bill the Arkansas legislature introduced in January 1911. And it's at this point Little Rock began to stir. In late February 1911, a large group, including some men, it was about 75 people altogether, created the Arkansas Political Equality League. And that was in Lulu Markwell's home at 1422 Rock Street, which unfortunately no longer exists. And this group allied itself to the NOSA. Women's suffrage bills were introduced in 1911 and 1913. This is from 1915, when it actually passed to become a proposed amendment to the Constitution. However, there were only 3 allowed on the ballot, and the women's suffrage didn't make it there. And they had a party, the representatives. They seemed to be quite happy that women's suffrage did not make it to the ballot. There was still other activity in spite of these setbacks. Suffragists won the Pulaski County Fair Parade in 1916. They held suffrage schools and they held special suffrage days at the ballpark 3 years running. Now, when Carrie Chapman Catt became president of the NOSA again in 1815, she encouraged suffragists to campaign for whatever suffrage they could get, including the federal amendment. And she appeared in Little Rock in 1916 to promote the new policy. She's there on the left, and at that time, a large number of suffrage supporters met her, and that was over at the Rock Island Station, which is now where the Clinton Center is. 18 automobiles decorated with suffrage emblems paraded the streets for a half hour after the distinguished workers' arrival. Many out-of-town suffragists came to hear the addresses. Now, second from the left is Mrs. T.T. Cotnam, who was very prominent in Little Rock, and on the right is Mrs. O.F. Ellington, also of Little Rock. And they were the leaders of the Arkansas suffrage movement. And they had many lieutenants, including Josephine Miller on the left and Gertrude Watkins, who organized Arkansas into branches after Catt's visit. And these 4 women involved Arkansas in national suffrage politics. In 1915, Cotnam, Ellington, and Watkins were campaigning in New York and for a failed suffrage campaign. But in 1917, Cotnam, Watkins, and Josephine Miller were back in New York and helped to win women's suffrage in New York, which was absolutely key in leading to the victory of suffrage in 1920. And that same year, 1917, Arkansas women achieved a great victory with NOSA's new policy. They won primary suffrage, and this is the story of the headlines from the governor signing that measure, which gave women primary suffrage. And they had a big parade in Main Street. They did a suffrage school as well, and they had a celebration in the Marion Hotel. So Little Rock was quite a hotbed of suffrage activity 100 years ago, but this is only half the story. Now, the NOSA's policy was in response to the policy of a new group which had revived the suffrage amendment, and this was the National Women's Party. This was a young organization, or an organization of younger women. Alice Paul, at this point, was only 26 when she started working for this in 1913. And they started off with the British militants. Now, if you saw Mr. Selfridge on Sunday evening, the WSPU was the group that Alice Paul and Lucy Burns joined. And they were both imprisoned. They were the first two of the first 3 suffragettes imprisoned in Scotland, and they went on hunger strike in the Dee prison. Later on, Burns worked in Edinburgh, and then in later 1909, Alice Paul was imprisoned. She went on hunger strike and was force-fed in England. And she returned in 1910, but it was in 1913 the 2 of them got together again in the US and brought much of what they had learned in Britain, not all of it, much of it back to the States. And this included huge marches, great national petitions, cross-country publicity tours, and innovative lobbying of members of Congress. In a revolutionary move, they demanded President Wilson's support for suffrage. And then they picketed the White House when he refused to do anything about it. And they refused to stop campaigning when the war began in 1917. And they were imprisoned, they were beaten up, they went on hunger strike, and they were tortured, but they stood their ground. And if you haven't heard of it, get hold of Iron Jawed Angels. It's in the library catalogue. It will blow your mind. The NWP revived Susan B. Anthony's terms of the suffrage debate from 1865 on one of their banners. And this one proclaimed, I don't know if you can read it, so I'll read it out. After the Civil War, women asked for political freedom. They were told to wait. This was the Negro's hour. And that was the actual words that was used at that were used at that time. In 1917, American women still ask for freedom. Will you, Mr. President, still tell them to wait, that this is the Puerto Ricans' hour? There was a debate at the time about bringing Puerto Rico into the US and giving the men the vote. The National Women's Party, like the NOSA, was a national organization, and Arkansas had links to it. Alice Paul visited in January 1916. The meeting took place in the Marion Hotel, which actually at this time became almost a headquarters for women's activity. It gives me the shivers to go over to what was yesterday the Peabody and is now the Marriott today. And I'm glad the ducks have gone. And they usually make a good meal, I think. Well, as we were in Memphis one time at the Peabody there, and with those ducks, you couldn't use the elevators. It was really good. I started concocting a little story in my head about those ducks getting stolen. Anyway. So Alice Paul visited in 1916, stayed at the Marion Hotel, and she achieved quite a coup. Not only did she establish a local organization, Adolphine Fletcher Terry became a member of the NWP's National Advisory Council. And the link between Alice Paul's group at the NWP and Adolphine Fletcher Terry was Lucy Burns, Alice Paul's second in command. She had been at Vassar 2 years ahead of Adolphine Fletcher Terry, and Terry credits Burns with awakening her to racism at the time they were at school together. Arkansas joined the NWP at the national level. This was the first picket that went out in January 1917, the very first. And the woman on the extreme right is called Pauline Floyd of El Dorado. And I don't know anything else about her, but this one photograph shows that Arkansas was involved in the new suffragism, the more pushy, aggressive, whatever you want to use. I don't like the word militant because people think that's violent, and these women were non-violent. They were part of it when the NWP began to up the ante to win women the vote. Now the NOSA didn't like the NWP upstarts. They were young. They began to steal the older ladies' thunder. And they also considered them unladylike because women weren't supposed to be standing outside the White House or anywhere with banners and pickets and saying things that rocked the boat, particularly when you start quoting back to President Wilson talking about democracy. When you haven't got democracy in your own country, you're not supposed to do things like that, particularly if you're a woman. Now, when the two groups didn't like each other, but Alice Paul kept quiet about it, but Carrie Chapman tend to be rather voluble. But the rift didn't become public, and for a while they worked together. And in 1914, there was a huge, big parade nationally, or meetings nationally, held on May the 2nd, and Little Rock took part. And this is what took place at the old State House. And afterwards, the people who had taken part in this rally walked in procession to the Capitol Hotel for a celebration luncheon. And Mrs. Cottenham and Josephine Miller were 2 of 24 speakers who gave 5-minute talks that day. This rally came about because Alice Paul had called for it. And, but this was the last time that the NOSA worked with the NWP. And local members kept their distance, the NOSA members kept their distance from Alice Paul when she visited here in 1916, but it actually got worse. When the hunger strikes began in 1917, the NWP sent emissaries to explain what the policy was about. And the local NASA objected. The Arkansas women's suffrage league will certainly make Miss Vernon realize when she arrives in Little Rock that the only welcome which awaits here is a Jack Frost welcome. That's what they said in the actual newspaper. And some locals did more because they made sure that Vernon's permit for a rally at City Hall was rescinded. Now, she held her meeting anyway at the Royal Arcadium Hall at 8th and Main, and she also held a couple of street meetings here at 4th and Main. And I don't know exactly which corner of 4th and Main, but I always get the feeling that's where that last store was. I just feel as if that was the power place, because of the size of it, even though this is from any. Sorry, that's my time. Tell me to hurry up. And also what's interesting about this intersection is if you look at the Woolworths building in the 1960s, that's where young African Americans went to start desegregating the lunch counters. Unfortunately, that building is gone, but we still have the glass store, and I think there's one other building left there. Now, women fought for and finally won passage of the federal amendment in June 1919. Arkansas became the 12th state to ratify. And these were the headlines when Arkansas ratified the 19th Amendment. But it was more than a year later that the 19th Amendment was fully ratified by Tennessee on August the 24th, 1920. And that was a cliffhanger vote. It was won by only one vote. And it was promulgated on August the 26th, 1920. Now, both the NASA and the NWP had campaigned hard for ratification. Josephine Miller, who I've mentioned several times, worked in the unsuccessful Alabama ratification campaign, and that same year, NASA had begun to reform itself into the League of Women Voters. After ratification, the National Women's Party regrouped, and in 1923 it launched the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, Paul believed an era was necessary because the 19th Amendment does not confer equality under the law. It stated only that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Women still couldn't run for office or even be notaries in Arkansas, and even with the 19th Amendment, restrictions applied. Indian and Asian women were still barred because of race, or women were barred because they had married foreigners. Or they were barred like men because they couldn't pay the poll tax, and this was very oppressive. In 1929, the poll tax was $1 annually. I don't have a figure for 1920, but the annual average per capita income was $310. And if you consider having two people in the house voting, a man and his wife, or a woman and her husband, that's a lot of money to be able to vote. However, the 19th Amendment increased the potential electorate by 26.5 million women. And that's an amazing number, and I don't think that will ever be, well, not in our lifetimes, be surpassed. And this number of potential male voters at that time was 31.5 million. And for the enfranchisement of Susan B. Anthony's subject half of the population, and for that fact alone, American women and the women of Arkansas, the ones I've mentioned here, and many others that we'll never know of, they deserve to be commemorated. But these women deserve remembering because their astounding, unique victory over tremendous opposition has changed American society. After ratification, women's suffrage workers conducted a well-organized education and registration campaign, and women all over the country worked to register all eligible women voters. And this is what happened in Arkansas when the League of Women Voters was actually, this is a report of it, we found it in December 1919, the NASA rolled over into the League of Women Voters. But one important feature of registration was that African American women all over the country rushed to register, and they even filed suit when they were blocked. So immediately after ratification, the suffrage amendment had an impact on race. In Arkansas in 1920, the first black man to run for governor was big news. And women's suffrage had made this possible. J.H. Blount, he's the one running for governor, counted on the Negro men and women of the state to elect him. And Blount's potential vote obviously had doubled with the 19th Amendment. In fact, it seems that black women were more interested in the vote than white women. This news story from North Little Rock after the November 1920 election tells the tale. In one polling place, it was said that 50 Negro women, but only one white woman voted. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for that. I don't know what it is, but you know, it's an interesting number. Now, another huge influence of the women's suffrage campaign was on freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. Suffragist women were the first group ever in the nation to picket the White House, and they fought for this right for themselves and for succeeding generations. And what the women did during World War I, African Americans could do later to promote their civil rights, and many other groups. And so there's also another reason to commemorate the women's suffrage movement, and this is mostly ignored in the histories. The women's suffrage movement was the first successful, non-violent civil rights movement in US history, and we deserve commemorating that. So in sum, as the Alice Paul Museum in Washington, D.C. states, the political strategies and tactics of Alice Paul and the NWP, and I would put the NOSA in here to a great extent as well, became a blueprint for civil rights organizations and activities throughout the 20th century. Adolphine Fletcher Terry knew this. The men that looked up to us and idolized us, they changed their attitude when we tied ourselves to telephone poles and did the most unladylike things to attract attention to our cause. The Negroes and college students are using the same tactics today. And she said this in 1969. But there's one lingering sad fact about this history. Now, the right to vote is the only right that women called for in 1848 that has made it to the US Constitution. Women still do not have equality under the law. And former suffragists 50 years on knew this. At an event in June 1966 in the Marion Hotel honouring Terry, several congratulatory messages were read out. One note came from Mrs. Fred I. Brown, who observed in it that she and Mrs. Terry had marched together years ago, carrying banners demanding equal rights for women. "Is Josephine here?" Mrs. Terry asked. When Mrs. Brown identified herself in the audience, the venerable lady cracked. "We still haven't got them." And that Josephine was the Josephine Miller that I've mentioned several times through the story. They were aware, they knew that yes, winning the vote was the first step, but there was still enough longer to go. So, and this small revealing incident that happened in '66, that was 2 years after Congress finally decided to enforce the rights of African Americans. And unfortunately today there's still no principle of equality on account of sex in the Constitution, but the ERA would ultimately inform all legal judgments in the United States and in every state. Unfortunately, we're still fighting for it. This was the 90th anniversary of women winning the vote in 2010 at the White House. I was there, and you know, it would be nice if we could see it happen. But there's no support from the President or the Congress. And Arkansas is one of 15 states that has not ratified that amendment. And unfortunately, there's no will in Arkansas to ratify it. Just last month, here we go, the Senate panel rejects it. Because the group tried to, Senator Elliott tried to get it put through. And so as the history of women's emancipation continues, I'll finish with a couple of questions. The women in this photograph are just some of those who fought for the right of Susan B. Anthony's subject class to be citizens with a say in government. And two major state centenaries are coming up. 1917, when women won primary voting rights, and 1919, when Arkansas ratified the 19th Amendment. Now, our suffragists shattered convention by campaigning in the streets for the right to vote. And that's the very same streets we can all walk in today. When I walk down them, I turn my head because I know poor old Ron, when he comes with me, I'll say, this is who did what, where, and, you know, and he gets the walking history. It changes your perception to know what happened, who did what, where. So is it too much to ask this city as a state capital, as a municipality, to put some markers where the women fought for the vote 100 years ago so that we can know, so that tourists can wander around and see it? It would be wonderful. Because that, you know, history always happens in a place. Doesn't happen just up in the air. And a third centenary comes up in 2023, and that will be the centenary of the launch of the Equal Rights Amendment. There's only one other amendment that's basically taken longer, and that's the Madison Amendment, which took 204 years to be ratified. And Arkansas in 1868 failed to give women the vote. A century ago, with primary suffrage, Arkansas was the first state in the South to give women the vote. And so is it too much to ask Arkansas today to ratify, or at least before 2023, to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment? I don't think so. It would be wonderful if it happened. And such an action would set the ball rolling for the very first time, making the US Constitution apply equally to all its citizens. Thank you.